Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, the 4th of February, 2026. A few days ago, an old friend of the show, Jonathan Rauch, had an influential essay on The Atlantic in which he announced he used to be a fascism skeptic. And when it comes to the Trump regime, at least, he believes that, yes, it is indeed fascism. So Donald Trump is in the August company of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, at least according to John. And I'm going to try and get John back on the show, actually, to talk more about it. Yesterday, an interesting new book came out on the F word, too. It's called To Catch a Fascist, The Fight to Expose the Radical Right. It's by my guest today, Christopher Mathias. Chris, I'm assuming you're in the Rauch camp, although I'm guessing also that you were never much of a skeptic. Did you always believe that Trump was a fascist?
Yeah, I think he certainly had those characteristics from the jump. I think as a journalist, I probably didn't use the term myself in a headline until 2019. It was actually a very specific scenario. I covered a Trump rally in Greenville, North Carolina, where I saw the president whip the crowd into a frenzy over Ilhan Omar and get the entire crowd to chant "Send her back." I ended up writing an article immediately afterwards called "A Fascist Trump Rally in Greenville," in which I kind of emailed a bunch of different scholars of fascism to ask for their take. So I guess I've been in using the F word camp for a minute.
So what for you, I don't want to turn this into a scholastic discussion of fascism.
Sure.
Everyone has different definitions. But what for you distinguishes a fascist from a conservative or just a reactionary?
Yeah, I guess it's always a little tricky because the way I kind of define fascism in the book, and it's kind of like my working definition, obviously, but is kind of like a right-wing politics of domination that situates a particular subgroup of people above a social hierarchy and then targets already marginalized groups for expulsion and death, all in this effort to kind of, quote, purify or cleanse a nation, to restore it to some mythical past of cultural and ethnic homogeneity. And I think, you could all, I think throughout the history of conservatism in America, it's always, danced around the edges of explicit fascism. And I think, something I try to get at in the book is that, in a way, fascism was in America before, we called it fascism. Langston Hughes, speaking at this writers' conference in the 1930s, famously said, like, you don't need to tell the Black man in America about fascism. We are familiar with Nordic supremacy and its trials. So I think when it comes to Trump and more recently using the F word, I think he basically took kind of a lot of maybe implicit or dog whistling, racism and bigotry, and just made it that much more explicit. And I think just exhibited a lot of the characteristics that I felt made him a fascist, and especially in the second administration. And like your friend of the show wrote in the Atlantic, I think the evidence is just everywhere now.
The original fascists, of course, Mussolini made the term up, fascism, Hitler. They were at one point, at least in their political careers, extremely popular.
Mhm.
Trump seems to have some degree of popularity. At least he won the last election. In your view, if you believe that Trump and his inner circle of fascists, does that make people who voted for him, or the majority of people who voted for him, does that make them fascists too?
You know, that's an interesting question. I think I would certainly characterize MAGA at this point as a fascist movement, and I think um, it is something we should come to terms with. You mean the like kind of explicit racism, not only in the last campaign, but of this current administration is just so blatant and over the top. Um, I, um, you know, whether or not, you know, it's interesting the way we use the word because I don't think anyone in the Trump administration would necessarily self-identify as a fascist, even though there was that hilarious moment with Zoran Mandani in the White House when Trump said, you know, call me a fascist, it's fine. Um, uh, but you know, as for calling individual Trump supporters fascists, I don't know. I mean, I think they're mixed up in something fascist for sure. You know, this is kind of a distinction I make in the book, right? Because the book is about anti-fascist activists who target, you know, what they see as fascist groups for, you know, confrontation, for espionage, for research, for kind of unmasking members of secretive fascist groups. But you know, they're identifying these people, they're unmasking these people and calling them fascists, calling them Nazis, but they're not, you know, going to Trump rallies and identifying Trump supporters as fascist or, you know, doxing them, exposing them. You know, they're kind of targeting the worst of the worst. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's an interesting question.
I'm not sure if you, given it's an interesting question, I'm not sure if you fully answered it.
Okay, what would be your take on that?
Well, I mean, of the, I don't know, however many million, 70, I don't know, 70, 80 million, 100 million people, Americans who voted for Trump,
Mhm.
of those who, I mean, what number approximately, 20, 30, 50% are fascists? I mean, it's an important question, for better or worse. I mean, I know it's a hard one to answer.
Yeah, it's just I mean, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to parse there, you know. I mean, like uh, in during the civil rights era, or I mean, if you go further back, I don't know, like during Reconstruction in America, um, like could you arguably call? I don't know what I'm getting at. I just think it's a really hard thing to parse. I think yes, I think they're part of a fascist movement. I don't know if I would call them in particular each and every Trump supporter a fascist.
I mean, the reason I ask, Chris, is because your book is about the fight to expose the radical right. And in part, I
Mhm.
guess it's a kind of an exercise in doxing
Yeah.
fascism. I mean, if there are 40 or 50 or 70 or 100 million Americans who voted for Trump, should they all be exposed? Should there be some sort of the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C.? Should there be a big wall, or should there eventually be a big wall somewhere where these people are identified in terms of their support for Trump? Is that what you're arguing? And to catch a fascist, who's to determine who gets to be exposed and who doesn't? That's my question.
Sure. Yeah, that's not what the book is arguing whatsoever. This is, have you read the book, Andrew?
Yes, I've looked at him.
You've looked at it, sure. Okay. So the book is, you know, basically about anti-fascist group, this kind of Antifa, you know, commonly the way we commonly call it, the kind of this decentralized underground network of anarchists and socialists who, you know, don't trust the state or law enforcement to combat um, fascists in their communities. So they do the work themselves. And the large part of the work they're doing is exposing, you know, very explicit neo-Nazis and white supremacists. These are members of groups like Identity Europa and Patriot Front and a lot of the Nazis that marched in Charlottesville. And they are doing the work to uncover the identities of these people, and often revealing them to be men in positions of power. And the idea of that is to kind of hold these people accountable, is to say, if you, for example, are, one of the stories is about a Nazi EMT who runs one of the most popular neo-Nazi podcasts in the country called The Daily Shoah. The Shoah, of course, being a word for the Holocaust. And he is working as a paramedic, as an EMT in Virginia. On that podcast, he makes explicit references and stories to treating Black patients differently. Anti-fascists expose this, it becomes a story, and he gets fired. There's another story, for example, of a neo-Nazi, a member of a group called Identity Europa, which is very explicit about wanting to expel non-white people from America. And he is in Charlottesville. He's the security guard for Richard Spencer, who's kind of the poster boy of the so-called alt-right in 2017. And then he goes back to Massachusetts afterwards, and he goes back to his job as a police officer. Anti-fascists figure out who he is. They publish a docs, or a story, if you will, and he basically resigns before he is fired. So from this perspective, this type of anti-fascist work is a form of community self-defense and accountability, and it's a way of kind of creating a social cost for being part of a fascist group. It's kind of a way of saying, like, yeah, you can join those groups if you want to, but you don't get to wear a mask. We're going to figure out who you are and hold you accountable for it.
The book, as you say, is sympathetic to that aspect of the Antifa movement. And you note in an interesting piece in the Nation that not all liberals are comfortable with that work of exposing people. What rights then do these individuals have when it comes to privacy? When should and shouldn't Antifa have the right to expose these people? You talked about, we've done shows on Charlottesville. Should everyone who showed up for that rally in Charlottesville, should they be exposed? Should they lose their jobs? Should they be humiliated?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one of the groups I profile in the book is a group of anti-fascist researchers called Ignite the Right. Ignite the Right is dedicated to doing exactly what you just said, is to identifying and exposing everyone that was in Charlottesville. And I was in Charlottesville. I covered it as a reporter, and I do not see a way in which you attended that rally without or participated in that rally without being an explicit neo-Nazi. It was one of the most horrible things I've ever witnessed or experienced. I interviewed people after the car attack. I witnessed the beating of DeAndre Harris. And yes, I think if you attended that as a member of, like, a participant in the Unite the Right rally, yeah, you probably deserve some accountability. Does that mean that there isn't a room or path for forgiveness or understanding? No, of course not. There's definitely an avenue for that. I think one of the things I talk about in the book is this kind of anti-fascists will often kind of do this thing called amnesty, where if you're a Nazi and you participate in something, but you've left the movement behind you, but you might be exposed, you will often go to these anti-fascists and be like, listen, I left this movement behind me. And anti-fascists will be like, okay, yeah, well, we won't do anything. We'll be honest though, like, if we see you mixed up in this again, we might, post something. So I think it's just a method of accountability.
What about the accountability, though, of Antifa? I mean, who is to determine who's on these boards and who is exposing who? It sounds to me, or to some liberals at least, it might sound as if there's a degree of moral equivalency here, of one group of radicals exposing another group for being evil. I'm guessing that right-wing radicals would probably have panels or groups or committees doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, totally. And you know, I think a lot of people will make that equivalency. You know, there is no board or leadership or headquarters for Antifa, despite what the Trump administration, you know, might say. It is typically, you know, decisions are arrived at locally and democratically and tediously. Um, and, you know, that's not to say they get it right every time. I do think that there is a big, you know, I will personally argue that there's not an equivalency between kind of right-wing doxing and the doxing I describe in the book. You know, I think, you know, I am in support of unmasking and identifying fascism in my community, and would rather it not go the other way around.
You wrote an interesting piece last week in The Guardian about Antifa unmasking not just neo-Nazis, but now members of ICE, the group, of course, who very much in the news, involved in their violence on the streets of Minneapolis. Lots of debate about whether or not ICE agents or people who are working for ICE should have the right to anonymity. What do you argue, Chris, in the book on catching a fascist in terms of ICE? In your view, is everyone who works for ICE a fascist?
You see, this is a kind of a distinction in terms that I think I don't, you know, get caught up in. Like, I'm not like I think it's worthy completely to identify the people in ICE right now. I think what ICE is doing right now is reprehensible, and I think it's part of a pretty explicit project of ethnic cleansing. And I think it, you know, in my personal opinion, I think it meets every definition of a fascist project. Now, does each individual, am I, you know, does each ICE agent, are they a fascist? You know, I don't know that they think of it consciously in that way or self-identify that way. But what I would say is that they are involved in a fascist project. And I also think that they are, you know, kind of publicly funded, um, you know, employees of the state. They are like kind of public officials in a way. And that typically, you know, police aren't masked and they have to identify themselves. Um, and so I think it's a very kind of scary escalation that the people doing this are wearing masks. And I think the reason, you know, thank you for bringing up the Guardian article. You know, I think someone I interview in that says that the reason that ICE wears masks is because they know what they're doing is unpopular, or you know that it might be wrong, and I think there's some truth to that. And you know, I'll also just say I think it's really interesting, and this is something I try to bring up in the book, is that you know throughout the history of American white supremacy, and specifically masked white supremacy, um, you know, you wear a mask in hopes of creating a world in which you won't need a mask at all. The first Klan wears a mask to kind of terrorize Black people in the South and to overthrow Reconstruction, to destroy the gains that recently freed Black people have gained. When Reconstruction is abandoned, you know, the Klan isn't really needed anymore, and it kind of disbands. That's part of the reason it disbands. They kind of, you know, trade the anonymity of the hood for the anonymity of the lynch mob. And I think it's important and to consider a world in which ICE agents are comfortable carrying out what they're doing without a mask. And yeah, I think that's the reason, as the Guardian article you brought up, you know, mentions, is that anti-fascists have, you know, kind of changed their targets and are identifying ICE agents in Minneapolis and elsewhere.
The article also quotes people who argue that you need to identify all ICE and DHS officers. That's the Homeland Security Department. Those are many thousands of people, Chris, aren't there? I mean, firstly, how's that going to work? And secondly,
it's targeting. I think you might be misreading. I think it's targeting Border Patrol agents active in the missions in Minneapolis on the streets to kind of abduct people off the street.
There are many thousands of those. I mean, they're not just on the street. They're on the streets of Los Angeles. They're on the border. They're in Minneapolis. Who knows where else they are? There are many thousands of these agents. Are you suggesting in the book that, leaving aside the F word, that they should all be somehow exposed, that everyone should know what they're doing and shamed, essentially?
So the book was written before the current kind of escalation of ICE. So I don't make an argument about that.
Although I'm guessing that this doesn't necessarily surprise you, what's happened on the streets of Minneapolis.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it is exactly what MAGA and Trump have promised to do. I mean, if you're going to promise to mass deport millions and millions and millions of people, of our neighbors and friends and loved ones, it's going to look like this, and it's going to be a spectacle. I think Stephen Miller, who I think a lot of reporting suggests this is kind of his brainchild and project, he is steeped in a kind of explicit white supremacist literature. His emails were leaked to the Southern Poverty Law Center years back, and they showed him just kind of swimming in these, waters online of, kind of explicit great replacement talk of the term remigration, which is really just a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, and kind of promoting books like Camp of Saints, which of course is like, this really kind of racist dystopian novel. No, I mean, sadly, I think like there's
and I take your point on Miller. I mean, I wouldn't argue with you on Miller, although everybody knows who he is. He doesn't wear a mask.
Right.
My question was about the tens of thousands of ICE agents who, presumably some of them at least, are looking for work, and they're working for the state in the way in which many Americans have done historically. Would you distinguish? I mean, is everyone who works for ICE, should they all be exposed, or is it only ICE agents on the streets or those who are violent? How are we going to know?
Well, I mean, that's what's happening. The current kind of grassroots effort to identify ICE, they're not identifying like administrative people, or I think there's actually there's a site called ICEList, which isn't like an Antifa project per se, but they make this distinction, I think, and I think this is what you're getting at, which is that like they're not going to identify the people working the daycare at DHS taking care of government employees' kids, like they're not going to dox or unmask the everyday employees necessarily of DHS. I think they are, so far at least, what they've done and what I've detailed in the article is that they are identifying people that have taken part in a particularly bad or brutal bits of violence, or kind of especially egregious abductions or deportations, whatever you want to call them. I think one of the officers that's identified in my article is someone who pepper sprayed a protester at point blank range. Some of the other people that they've identified were the agents seen bringing an elderly man out of his house shirtless in like 0-degree temperature as his grandchild looked out the window. I think they are targeting those people. I don't really see them, nor would they necessarily have the resources at this point to identify, the thousands of employees of DHS. I think they are creating accountability for, the people committing kind of the most egregious acts.
And how would you respond to an ICE agent? I don't suppose one would appear on this show, probably not show their face, certainly, but who would simply say, well, we're just doing our job and we we're trying to obey the rules of the state when it comes to immigration.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it sounds almost trite to say, but we're just doing our job. Sounds a lot like we're just following orders. Which of course, I think in moments like this, it's important to say that there are some orders that shouldn't be followed, and what is happening, particularly in Minneapolis, from all accounts from the people living there is a straight up occupation. I think there's been reports, I think maybe in Zeteo or elsewhere, kind of detailing that morale is not necessarily high within ICE at the moment. And I think they see that this huge community uprising in response, they know how unpopular they are, and that they might have to live with the shame of what they're a part of for a while. We're seeing the popularity of ICE and this project of these deportations just kind of plummet in the polls, and a phrase like "abolish ICE," which a few years ago I think felt like pretty radical, is reaching an all-time record high. Even 20% of Republicans support abolishing ICE at this point, or support that phrase, I believe. Yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot your initial question, but
No, I think you answered it.
yeah.
So for you, or perhaps for the Antifa group, and maybe this is a compelling argument, shame is a powerful political tool.
Yeah. No, I think that's really it, and I'm glad you put it that way, because I've been thinking a lot about it this week, because Tom Homan, of course, the head of ICE at the moment,
Yeah.
he recently came out with a statement where he tried to kind of flip my book on its side, right? He said, like, we're filming the people that are standing up against ICE, and we're going to create a database, and they're going to be shamed, and they're going to lose their jobs. So like there is, like, in a way, I think, and I'm so glad you phrased the question that way, Andrew. There is like kind of this battle over shame and what we're supposed to be ashamed of, and I think it's just it's a push and a pull. It's a real fight.
So what becomes, as I said, you've been quite critical, I think, of conventional liberals when it comes to this stuff. What becomes of our right to privacy? Is that only people who are moderates who have a right to privacy, or people on the left?
I think the argument for unmasking kind of straight up fascist is just a form of community self-defense. It's to know that there are people in your community that are explicitly calling for violence online, that are liable to commit violence. One of the stories I tell in the book, and I will admit, like, this is not like from the kind of militant anti-fascist perspective. They have a different approach to concepts of freedom of speech than your kind of more moderate liberal. But one of the stories I tell in the book is that an anti-fascist spy goes into the planning server for the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where all these Nazi groups are planning the event. And this spy collects reams of data, of memes and messages, just kind of evidence of these Nazis' murderous intent for that day. He gives them to local anti-fascists in Charlottesville, who then give them to the local city government, pleading with the mayor, the council, to revoke these Nazis' permit for their rally. The officials decide not to do that. And of course, what happens in Charlottesville happens. And I think from like the militant anti-fascist perspective, like, these fascists always pose an inherent threat when they're allowed to organize. And it's a fight to to stop their violence from happening. And part of that work is unmasking them and knowing who they are. In the pre-internet era, this anti-fascist work in America in the 80s and 90s often involved activists like digging through the dumpsters of like neo-Nazis' houses and finding discarded mail and finding their real names, and then posting, meet your local Nazi posters on telephone poles. Um, so but back to your original question, like who is deserving of privacy? I think we are all deserving of privacy, but I think if you are actively, you know, agitating as a part of a movement to expel a good portion of this country for not being white, then it's a matter of kind of actual community self-defense to know who those people are.
I love the title of the book. It reminds me, of course, your book is
Yeah,
called To Catch a Fascist, Hitchcock's 1952 or 1955 movie, To
yeah.
Catch a Thief, with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. Very
Which
different.
which I still haven't watched. I should
Oh, you
watch that
haven't
too.
watched it? Yeah,
No, yeah.
it's very different. Are you? And of course, it's a fun movie and a romantic movie. Are you optimistic now, given what happened on the streets of Minneapolis? Do you feel that the worst is over, Chris?
Yeah, I really don't know. I think we've had so many moments like this where because we did in a sense see Trump like retreat a little bit in Minneapolis, right? Like he dispatched with Bovino, kind of the guy in charge, the who really dressed like a Nazi. Um, but um, we also know that abductions and these kind of deportations are taking place all over right now, still in places like Los Angeles and even in New York, where I am. And um, all I can say is that what we saw in Minneapolis, I personally found very heartening. It was like an organic grassroots response by the people there to say that this is not acceptable, and it reminded me a lot of the kind of grassroots militant anti-fascist response to the wave of fascist groups and Nazi groups that marched on the streets of America in 2017 and 2018, where you are confronting these people in the streets, you're following them, you're monitoring them, you're identifying them, you're pressuring venues and hotels not to host them. It's just creating a social cost. And we've seen that all over Minneapolis. And I think it's working, and I think it's providing a model of resistance for across the country. So in that way, yes, I feel optimistic. I think one of the mantras that a couple mantras or axioms that you hear in anti-fascist circles are we protect us. And I think Minneapolis showed that they weren't relying on the law enforcement, they weren't relying on the Democratic Party or their local government to defend themselves against ICE and defend their neighbors against ICE. They realized that it was up to them to defend their neighbors. And then the other expression you hear a lot, and maybe I just have Woody Guthrie on the mind, but is all you fascists bound to lose. And I do think that fascism is ultimately a self-destructive ideology because it constantly needs to manufacture new targets and new subgroups to scapegoat and eliminate. Until eventually, there's no one left. It's kind of like a snake eating its own tail. I do think that this fascist moment, that this fascist movement is bound to lose. It's just kind of what's important right now is to stop this movement from doing as much destruction as possible.
So you seem to be saying two things. On the one hand, it's going to eat itself, so we could just leave it alone. On the other hand, you seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, to be suggesting that in some ways, these people, or at least their views, should be illegal. So
No, I'm not saying they should be illegal. I'm saying that there should be consequences. I think one of the analogies that I draw in the book is, let's say you're in a bar and a guy comes in and starts shouting racial slurs, maybe throws up a Nazi salute, there's a recognition that that guy poses a threat, that he's liable to do something, and you're going to ask him to leave. If he doesn't leave, you might force him to leave. I think I feel like your question's kind of around freedom of speech. Am I correct, Andrew? Or
Yes, yes.
yeah, okay, yeah. So I think there's the distinction I think maybe I'm trying to draw here is not like freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. It like if you say racist shit in a bar, you're liable to get punched. And I don't know if that's a bad thing.
Tomorrow we've got lawyer Andrew Guthrie Ferguson. He has a new book out called Your Data Will Be Used Against You. Are you at all concerned, Chris, that the tactics that you're supporting in this new book, To Catch a Fascist, will be used by the right against guys like yourself, or certainly members of Antifa?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is essentially what I think what you're touching on is that, and what I describe in my book is that it is essentially an underground war of intelligence and counterintelligence. It's kind of an informal intelligence agencies at war with each other, if you will. There definitely are far right efforts and right wing efforts to identify anti-fascist activists, and there are websites to that effect. We also saw during the uprisings and the protests against the genocide in Gaza that there were websites like Canary Mission that were identifying members of those demonstrations. There's a website called Antifa Watch, which claims to identify members of Antifa. I personally have been doxxed, and by doxxed I mean when I say doxxed in the anti-fascist sense, I mean the kind of the digital equivalent of ripping the white hood off of a Klansman. When I say I personally was doxxed, it means my phone number and address and that of my family's was posted online, and we all received death threats, and I had to file police reports. So that is definitely already happening. I will say that I think the left is much better and much more careful at it as a project. The right often misidentifies people all the time, or is very sloppy with it. And I think when the right does it, they often do it as a way of inviting real harassment and violence. Whereas I think a lot of the anti-fascist doxes I describe in my book, sometimes they might post a Nazi's address, but most of the time they're not. So yeah, it's definitely kind of already happening. It's a bit of a battle.
It certainly is a bit of a battle. Interesting conversation. The book is out. It was out yesterday. To Catch a Fascist: The Fight to Expose the Radical Right. Very interesting. I'm going to bring the book up when I talk to Andrew Ferguson tomorrow. Congratulations, Chris, on the new book, and continue with your good work. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew. This was a pleasure.